Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay, and you are listening to the new Discourses Podcast, and we are doing another exciting episode of the Nazi Experiment series. In fact, this should be the 13th volume of that series. If we stick to the formally numbered ones, there are a couple others floating around beyond those. And we explored in the last episode this idea of the fake Christian religion that was offered to Germans as a bridge faith, as I called it, a way to get off of their Christian beliefs and onto Nazi beliefs. Think of it like a ferry boat. And this movement was called the Positive Christianity Movement, and I read to you from a book called Positive Christianity and the Third Reich that is by, I'm assuming it's pronounced Caius, it's C-A-J-U-S, Caius Fabricius. I said that's probably a pseudonym and went on and on about that, and that I wasn't sure if he was real. Turns out he is real. I looked into that. That is him. I don't know for sure if that's his real name, but that's the name. And anyway, I digress. We talked about the Positive Christianity Movement, and I explained in that episode that Alfred Rosenberg is Hitler's chief ideologist. That was literally his job. Chief ideologist of the Reich. So it was Alfred Rosenberg's job, his duty, to tell the story of the Nazi people, to write the myth that they would sign up to, the pseudo-tradition that these pseudo-traditionalist fascists would adopt and believe as the true tradition of their people. And there's an important point there. The radical right, the fascist right, or the woke right, really, what makes them woke is partly this. The woke right subscribes to not traditionalism like conservatives do, but to pseudo-traditionalism, which means false traditionalism. And the distinction is this, that the real traditionalism of real conservatives, people like Edmund Burke and so on, is that you are seeing yourself as having the duty to pick up the torch in an unbroken chain of past through present into future. Your society, your people came along. They had traditions, they have values, they have principles, they have a way that they've organized life and society, which for Edmund Burke in England was in fact broadly English liberal. And your ancestors forged over time with small changes here and there this tradition to follow, and they have passed the torch to you. So you have an obligation to learn from that tradition, to embody that tradition, to pick up that tradition. Notice that this is in direct contradiction to the communist objective of solving what they call the problem of reproduction. They're going to disrupt from one generation to the next the transmission of society. So the communists want to break that chain and take society somewhere else. Well, you are now the torchbearer. You are the link in the chain at the point of history in which you live, and you have future generations to think of. So you have to safeguard your tradition that you've inherited from your ancestors, and then you have to clarify it, embody it, live it, share it, articulate it, and teach it to future generations, the next link in the chain, so that your posterity will also be able to take part in this living tradition. That's the conservatism of Edmund Burke. And what we have on this woke right is in fact not that. It appeals to that, but it is not that. It is pseudo-traditionalist. Okay, so the idea would be that there's this chain of history and you are that link at the moment. But what they're really doing is breaking from the real tradition of your society to inject a new one. And the way they're selling it to people, just like the communists, and the way they're selling it to people is by writing a new myth that's a new unbroken chain, even though it never existed, and then taking people on that new path. So they're disrupting just like the communists. They're breaking the reproduction of traditional values from one generation to the next, with you at the link in the center. But what they're doing instead of the communists and just disrupting it in anti-traditionalism, throwing out the past, destroy the four olds or smash the four olds like they did in Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, is now they're going to write a fake history and tell you that's the history we've always belonged to. To be fair, the communists also write a fake history, but they write a fake history of how everything was always bad, and therefore we're going to overthrow this finally at this point in history and go in a new direction. The fascists write a different history, is that the further back the chain you get, the more pure and good and primordially virtuous it is, and it got corrupted and corrupted and corrupted by one generation after the next. So we've actually lost the real tradition, so that's why they have to reintroduce the real tradition, and now we're all going to follow that. So it's the same idea as the communists. It's a actual rejection of conservatism in the Edmund Burke sense, but in a way that poses as it. The left, the Marxists, the communists reject the traditionalism of Burke. The fascists or woke right emulate it. It's not traditional. It is pseudo-traditional. They write a pseudo-tradition, a false tradition, and try to hijack a society by saying, guys, you've been lied to about your past. It is not like you think. It is different than you think. And now we know the real past, and now we're going to go in this direction that we always should have been going. Let's go forward. Avanti in Italian, as Mussolini called his magazine. Okay, so that introduction to this kind of aside, we went into the positive Christianity movement, and I talked about Alfred Rosenberg, and I even read a small piece about positive Christianity from his book, The Myth of the 20th Century, which he published in the 1930s, early 1930s, or maybe very end of the 1920s. I have to double check the publication date. But I'm going to read to you in this episode from The Myth of the 20th Century a little bit more fully. And I'm not positive as I read through this book. It's 600 and something pages long. These people write a lot of stuff. It's entirely plausible that I will do a tangential side podcast series on this book and its predecessor specifically. Its predecessor is Houston Stewart Chamberlain's Foundations of the 19th Century, which volume 1 at least is 930 something pages long, and I have not read it yet. But these are foundational texts for the ideological and mythological view of the world that informed Hitler's racialist worldview. And it's a doozy. So that's, like I said, I want this episode to be part of the Nazi experiment because it's going to explain the Nazi racial ideology, as we've talked about, or worldview, as we've talked about in most of the episodes of this series. And it's gonna reveal the mythology of the Nazi experiment. But this book itself is so crazy pants that it's probably worth doing more with it and not bogging down the Nazi experiment series with it. So as a matter of housekeeping, I say that, but we're going to kind of dive into this after I do a quick introduction of what this series is about. If you're new to the series, even though you're in episode 13, just briefly summarize. This is many episodes deep now. I've summarized it many times. The idea is that I'm watching, especially young American conservatives, men in particular, but some are older, some are female, some are women, not younger women also, but mostly it's young men. Not overwhelmingly mostly, but mostly it's young men, be seduced by what amounts to this Nazi experiment. They're being seduced by the rhetoric and ideas of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, sometimes with attribution, and frequently, much more frequently, without attribution. You're seeing the same arguments being given that come from places like Mein Kampf and from maybe even this positive Christianity movement or this myth of the 20th century. They're being told the same kinds of things about their circumstance, and they are believing them, and they are getting sucked into this way of thinking such that they attach to it, that they identify with it, and then later when they discover it's Nazi, which eventually they will, the idea is that they'll say, oh, well, that's fine, Nazis were good, and just go with it. And so the premise is that if we can take a step back and say, look, I think we should be able to agree that actually what happened, if we look at it objectively with the Nazis, is very bad. You're talking about a totalitarian movement in its own description of itself, totalitarian, no freedom. Absolutely, everybody is going to serve the state. They're like a cell in the body of the state, and the government is like its brain. So your job as a person is to serve the state in the same way that the cell does its functions as a part of the body. This is the corporatism of fascism and National Socialism. And it is imperialistic. It is warlike. It has a crazy ideology, which we're going to explore some today, but we've explored in depth already from Hitler's own words. It had a genocidal intent of removing all Jews from Europe so that Europe could be freed up of racial contamination and ideological and economic and political contamination, and could move forward under the power of a German empire or a German Reich. And it ends up starting a world war, executing a Holocaust, a mass murder of millions, 6 million Jews plus a few million more people, whether they are physically or mentally disabled, or other things that the Nazis don't like, racially inferior or contaminating or whatever, that the Nazis don't like. But 6 million Jews murdered for being Jews, which Hitler saw as a pestilence and a parasite upon Europe and a destroyer of its cultural capacities and hopes. It's Aryans versus Jews. The Aryan that he sees as the German is the anti-Jew, and this book that we're going to explore is one of the books that outlines the Aryan ideology, the actual myth. And anyway, the point is, short version, Nazi experiment. Germany had problems after World War I. Big problems. They lost World War I. They were humiliated. They were bankrupted. Many of their people died. A lot of their best people died. Their bravest and most, valuable young men killed in this unbelievable war. And they were sanctioned. They were prohibited from having a military. They were in bad shape. Jobs were not exactly available. Everything was kind of bad. So you have this situation of national downturn and humiliation, embarrassment, and stress. And the Nazis come along and propose an experiment to make Germany great. And what they propose turns out to be one of the greatest catastrophes of human history. Probably the greatest intentional catastrophe of human history, and not the greatest unintentional catastrophe of human history. So we know that this experiment sought to solve problems that everyday Germans perceived and resonated with as the propaganda came from Hitler and his Nazis, but that the solutions that were provided were very poor. So the idea that you can say, as we hear from the so-called woke right, is that we can adopt Marxist analysis and adopt Marxist thinking, but change the fundamental basis of the analysis and then adopt different or arrive at different solutions to apply with similar structural force. This idea is patently wrong. This idea is a disaster. This idea is being sold along with the rhetoric and the ideology of the Nazis, and is being lapped up by our unfortunately unaware, unfortunately because of their education system and because of our educational priorities, ignorant young people in remarkably strong and fast ways. And so part of this, as we've talked about in several episodes before, like I said, going straight from Hitler in many cases in the Nazi experiment, was the Nazi racialist worldview, as Hitler referred to it, that blood is the central race. Blood is the central object of human experience, of human relevance. And so where I said this before, so where the communists had this idea that they're going to seize the means of production, meaning the means of economic production. They're going to seize the means of economic production, and that's going to allow them to remake man and arrive at an ideal totalitarian society that comes out perfectly liberated. The Nazis had the belief that it's race, not economics, that makes man who they are, who he is. Therefore, they're going to seize the means of racial production. They're going to purify the race. They're going to get rid of racial contaminants that are also any ideology that contributes to racial contamination, and they're going to return to this Aryan ideal, the Nordic Aryan ideal. And this book, The Myth of the 20th Century, tells that story of what they believed they were working back toward. Now, I have to add a caveat, because I've read this in more than one place I read this in They Thought They Were Free, which is by Meyer, is his last name. I can't think of his first name at the moment. And I read this in Melita Moshman's account Rendered, which I did some podcasts on. That the average German Nazi did not believe this bullshit. They thought this race stuff was pretty silly. They didn't really go in for it. They were there for largely other reasons. So the ideology itself was not deterministic in terms of getting people's belief whipped up. What it actually was about was setting the kind of guidestones by which the leadership of the Nazis tried to figure out how they should organize their society and their world. As Hitler's made very clear, the entire, in Mein Kampf, the entirety of the Nazi apparatus, of the political apparatus, the party and the state, would be organized in line with achieving the goals of the racialist worldview. Alfred Rosenberg, who wrote the book, The Myth of the 20th Century, that I'm going to read from today, was the chief ideologist of that project. He was the one writing the story that the Nazi leadership was going to believe that the positive Christianity movement was going to try to use. This was the destination point. This is the Nazi belief system. And like I said, your average rank and file German in the 1930s didn't buy it. They didn't think this was really, really true. But it was the guidestone by which the Nazi party itself set its course. And so I'm going to read this to you from chapter 1, which, by the way, is almost 100 pages long. This book is really something. The total book is 616 pages. That's a lot to read. Chapter 1 is titled Race and Race Soul. Race soul with a hyphen, as in one object. Race and race soul. So your soul is located in your race. Your race as a collective entity has a soul that you are a part of in that corporatist system, cell in a larger body. Okay, and your soul has to be understood as in a racial sense. For those of you that have heard me talking about Helena Blavatsky and her theosophy and the idea of root races, and therefore kind of like levels to your soul, that getting attached to race by the Ariosophists and by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who wrote the foundations of the 19th century, which precedes this book. That is the similar idea, but Blavatsky had a very different idea than these idiots. Blavatsky believed that this transformation, her theosophy was that this transformation of racial souls, if you want, or levels to the soul levels, root race levels, would progress mostly organically by the guidance of enlightened masters or whatever, but over the course of thousands, if not millions of years per level. And the idea was not adequate for a lot of the people who followed Blavatsky. I'm not absolving Blavatsky of her insanity and her evil, because it's very much stamped on this. But if you turn and look at Margaret Sanger with Planned Parenthood, or Alice Bailey and her ravings, including Education in the New Age, where she writes some of this very explicitly, or even, elements of the Fabian Society, Annie Besant being a crossover point there, or if you look at this Ariosophy that derived from the theosophy of Helena Blavatsky that then informed Hitler's Nazi race ideology, what you see is, in all cases, this very early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century eugenics idea that they're going to make it happen faster, that they're going to force it to come about. So chapter 1 is titled Race and Race Soul in the Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg, and he's going to outline the race ideology of the Nazis in its kind of purest distillation. Whereas Hitler ranted in Mein Kampf written in the 1920s, this is a very pure, thought-out distillation. This is the pseudo-history and the pseudo-tradition that these guys believed. And I'm going to read the kind of very beginning part, and then I'm going to basically touch on a little bit, and I'm going to skip really far down, like 70 pages, down to where he does the positive Christianity and the history of Christianity bit that I read from previously in the other podcast about positive Christianity, volume 12, and then I'm going to read the whole thing, and then I'll stop there. But what he does talk about, he has a section near the end of this chapter that is called I think it's called the myth of blood, which is the myth of the 20th century. So just to answer the question, what is the myth of the 20th century, is the myth of blood. That blood, that is race, is deterministic, and that there is in fact a racial hierarchy, and there is a superior Nordic race that precedes all of the dramas of the world as we know them, and that these were the original Aryans, and that they have come to various cultures, whether Indian or Persian or Levantine or Greek or Roman or German or Celtic, and slowly their influence waned as they were racially contaminated, etc. And so let's read the myth of the 20th century from the first chapter. And he starts off really bold. An epoch is beginning today in which world history must be rewritten. That's the first sentence of this book. I'll just read it again because holy crap. An epoch is beginning today in which world history must be rewritten. So all of our past so far, there's your pseudo-traditionalism right there, is this first sentence. All of our past so far, unreliable. We have to rewrite history. So we're going to be traditionalist. We're going to follow the idea of an unbroken chain from past through present into future. The ancestors and the dead generations passing through the living today, handing off to the future generations. You have that motif of traditionalism, but for a past that doesn't exist and a future that they're trying to bring into being. It's a false traditionalism. It is a false conservatism. It is not actually right-wing or conservative or whatever you want to call it. It is pseudo-traditional, and you hear it right there. An epoch is beginning today in which world history must be rewritten. Past images have faded. Notice it's not smash the four olds. There were images before they faded. Past images have faded, leading personalities have been distorted, their inner driving forces misinterpreted, and generally their whole nature utterly misjudged. So he's going to tell the real history because what we have is a false history. He's going to tell, we have to rewrite history because the real story has been, by one means or another, faded, distorted, misinterpreted, misjudged. The real story has been corrupted. Generation after generation of people not fulfilling their full duty to the real story have softened the story, slandered the wrong people, distorted the characters, distorted what happened, and so on. He says a youthful, notice the appeal to youth, a youthful life force, one which is also ancient, is impelled toward form. An ideology, a worldview has been born and with strength of will begins to contend with old forms, with ancient sacred practices, and with worn out standards. This occurs not historically but fundamentally, not in a few special fields but everywhere, not only at the heights but also at the roots. So that's a hell of a first paragraph to this book. Two pieces to it, of course. That first part, the youthful life force. The goal is to attract young people. All the old people, yeah, they're set in their ways, but they're old, they're tired, they are not youthful, they are not forward-moving, but it's also ancient. You're still connected to that primordial, unsullied, pure virtue of the deep past. But a youthful life force is impelled toward a form, and that form is an ideology and a worldview, and it has been born. They're telling you again the pseudo-tradition. Rosenberg is telling you a new way of thinking, a new ideology, a new worldview has been born. It's not what your parents believed, but it has youthful energy and with strength of will begins to contend with the old forms. So you still have the smash the four olds energy, but for a completely different reason. And this is happening not some places, but everywhere, not only at the heights, but also at the roots. It's completely totalizing, a totalitarian rewrite of the world. And the sign of the times is reflected in a turning away from absolute values, which is to say, in a retreat from values claimed to be beyond all organic experience, which the independent ego once devised to create by peaceful or violent means a universal spiritual community. At one time, such an ultimate aim was the Christianizing of the world and its redemption through the second coming of Christ. Another goal was represented by the humanist dream of mankind. Both ideals have been buried in the bloody chaos of World War I. He says of the World War, but it's clarified in brackets. And in the subsequent rebirth from this calamity. This despite the fact that both still find increasingly fanatical adherents and a venerable priesthood. These are dying processes, no longer possessing any vitality. Any belief that has died in the soul cannot be raised from the dead. So that second paragraph is pretty heavy too. So the sign of the times is, look, we just had a cataclysm, World War I. Now people are turning away from absolute values. Up until this point, we've had two major projects, he's saying, which is, in Europe at least, which is Christianity and humanism, by which we're really talking about Marxism, because Marx's goal was humanizing. Okay, and he says these ideas have been buried by World War I in the bloody disaster, and there's then a rebirth. So I just want to say, we're not exonerating any of this, but a lot of what was going on in the interwar period was reckoning with the First World War. A lot of the Nazi experiment is in fact a reaction to the shock and horror of what World War I represented. Nothing like it had ever happened, or even ever could have been conceived. Death on a scale you could not believe, mechanical horrors, artillery like no one has ever imagined, things that just are unbelievably gruesome and bloody. The worst thing, arguably, that had ever happened was World War I. And not only did the Germans have to suffer it as badly as everyone else in the world, but they also had to suffer losing and being blamed for having it come up in the first place and sanctioned for it, creating those dissatisfied conditions into which the Nazi experiment is injected. But he talks about this rebirth. That's the rebirth. It's a rebirth in trauma to something completely different. Rebirth from this calamity. Even though there are still, he says, increasingly fanatical adherents and venerable priesthood to Christianity and what he calls humanism, but they are dying processes. I just want to make that very clear to you. This guy does not like Christianity. Make it really clear. It is a dying process, but he has some really, really choice things to say in this book as far as I've read so far, and probably more later, to talk about how much he doesn't like Christianity, whether he's trashing Paul, whether he's rewriting Jesus, it doesn't matter. Whether he's bashing the popes, he does not like Christianity, including Catholicism. And he ends with any belief that has died in the soul. So Christianity is a belief that has died in the soul. World War I killed it. Who could believe in that now? And it has died in the soul, cannot be raised from the dead. Therefore, something new. Again, with the proof that we're talking about a pseudo-traditional trajectory here. Mankind, he has in scare quotes, mankind, the universal church and the sovereign ego, divorced from the bonds of blood, are no longer absolute values for us. They are dubious, even moribund dogmas lacking in polarity, and which represent the displacement of nature in favor of abstractions. This is the same kind of talk you hear from Marx, but what you're talking about now is that people have real lives in Marx, and economic idiocy has divorced them from their real lives, the nature, if you will, the experience of their lives in favor of abstractions like money as an abstraction, capitalism as an abstraction, the classes are abstractions. And so there are real things happening that create real issues for the members of those classes. But everything, even these churches and these ideas, mankind, the universal church and the sovereign ego, those things are moribund, dubious dogmas lacking in any polarity. And they are just abstractions. And he says the thing that makes them divorced from reality is their divorce from the bonds of blood. The myth of the 20th century, as he's laying it out, is that race is deterministic. Or, as the kids these days say, demographics is destiny. He says the emergence of Darwinism and positivism in the 19th century constituted the first powerful, if still completely materialistic, protest against the lifeless and suffocating ideas that came from Syria and Asia Minor and brought about spiritual degeneracy. Christianity, with its vacuous creed of ecumenicalism and its idea of humanitas, disregarded the surge of red-blooded vitality that flows through the veins of all peoples of true worth and genuine culture. Blood was reduced to a mere chemical formula and explained that way. So Darwin, evolutionary thinking, and positivism are replacing these old dogmas, but what's their problem? They're still completely materialistic. But they serve as what? A protest against the lifeless and suffocating ideas that came from Syria, that's Christianity, guys, and Asia Minor, that's the entire Middle East, which includes this idea of humanitas, that Christianity particularly, and brought about spiritual degeneracy. Christianity, with its vacuous creed of ecumenicalism and its idea of humanitas, humanity, universal humanity, that we're all image bearers of God. Christianity and that idea disregarded the surge of red-blooded vitality. This guy hates Christianity. And what he hates Christianity for is that it disregarded the surge of red-blooded vitality that flows through the veins of all people of true worth and genuine culture. It is anti-racialist. That's why he hates Christianity. Because it believes in this idea of universal dignity. That it believes in this idea of all men are created equal. In the American expression, it believes in this idea of being created in the image of God, in the imago Dei, and that humanity, humanitas itself, is the problem. Why? Because it's not racist. That's why. That's the myth of the 20th century. He says blood was reduced to a mere chemical formula and explained that way, but today, an entire generation, again with the young people, but today an entire generation is beginning to sense, they're noticing, that values are only created and preserved where the law of blood still determines a person's ideas and actions, whether consciously or unconsciously. This is the same thing that's happening now. We're having loads of young people being convinced that race really matters, that blood is really important, and therefore that Christianity is vacuous and based on rotten ideas like equal humanity. This guy hates Christianity. The point of positive Christianity was to lure in Christians by saying this is like a positive version of Christianity and to take them across the river on ferry or by bridge to deposit them in this racialist slop. That was the goal. Okay. He says at the subconscious level, this is our younger generation that's taken up noticing. We're noticing race and the relevance of race to everything. At the subconscious level, whether in culture or in life, humans obey the commands of the blood, as if in dreams or according to natural insight, as a happy expression describes this harmony between nature and culture. But culture, he says, with the growth of all subconscious activity and of expanding consciousness and knowledge, red flag, becomes more and more intellectual. So culture over time, because of developments, becomes more and more intellectual and ultimately yields not creative tension, but rather discord. In this way, reasoning and understanding are divorced from race and nature. I don't know if reason and understanding here are given in the Hegelian what would it be? Vernunft and Verstand. I don't know if that's what it is. Reason and understanding are divorced from race and nature. So the real foundations of reason and understanding are race and nature. That's the eugenic misappropriation of Darwin that these guys all have, that Hitler is at the core of their belief system. It shocks me that Christians are getting in on this. It is purely a evolutionary model, except, and here you heard it nakedly, and except that he doesn't even get evolution right. It's not about fitness within one's niche. It is about becoming superior through basically surviving difficulty, which is not actually what evolution proposes. In this way, reason and understanding are divorced from race and nature and released from the bonds of blood. So he's saying there's no foundation for reason and understanding outside of the bonds of blood, and that's the error. So culture has become rotten as well because it's not based in blood, which is its true foundation. This is why I said their goal is going to be to seize the means of racial production in order to seize the means of human production, just like the communists are seize the means of economic production so as to seize the means of human production. The ensuing generation falls victim to the individualistic system of intellectual absolutes. That's the consequence of not having all knowledge and understanding, reason and understanding based in blood, is that the ensuing generation, the one that learns this deracinated culture, falls victim to the individualistic system of intellectual absolutes and increasingly separates itself from its natural environment, mixing itself with alien blood. So therefore, taking wives outside of your own race, quite literally, miscegenation. It is through this desecration of the blood that personality, people, race, and culture perish. That's the hypothesis of the myth of the 20th century. You have this ancient Nordic race, and everywhere they went, they ended up contaminating their race through tolerance of the alien blood, the outsider that's not Aryan too. And by increasingly separating yourself from your natural environment, you mix with alien blood, and that is a desecration of the blood that kills personality, people, races, and cultures. None who have disregarded the religion of the blood have escaped this nemesis, neither the Indians nor the Persians, neither the Greeks nor the Romans, nor will Nordic Europe escape if it does not stop. It must begin turning away from bloodless absolutes and spiritually empty delusions, and once again listen to and trust the subtle welling up of the ancient sap of life and values. This is why when you hear things like J.D. Vance saying almost 2 years ago that America is not a country based just on an idea, but it is also a people and a place, he's not just making a heartfelt appeal. There is a damn good reason that people heard more in that statement than maybe he said or maybe he meant. It's hard to say what's inside JD's head or inside JD's heart, but to evoke that the true sap of what it means to be American, what is an American, is a people and a place, as the woke right have done repeatedly, is that its blood and that its soil evokes this myth of the 20th century, which is from Hitler's chief ideologist, which created an ideology that guided one of the greatest intentional catastrophes, probably the greatest intentional catastrophe of human history. Both the Holocaust and World War II being direct consequences of this view. But notice this last part. Nor will Nordic Europe escape. All of these other great civilizations have perished because they didn't follow the law of blood, the religion of blood actually, not the law, the religion of blood. And Nordic Europe will not survive either if it doesn't stop. It has to cut this all out. It must begin turning away from bloodless absolutes and spiritually empty delusions. It can't think of itself as a propositional nation anymore. It must once again listen to and trust the subtle welling up of the ancient sap of life and values, which are located to the German mind, the Nazi mind, in blood and soil. As soon as we recognize the awesome conflict between blood and environment and between blood and blood as the ultimate phenomenon beyond which we are not permitted to probe, notice that we're not allowed to go there, right? Actually, that's not what he's saying. You can't get past that. The ultimate phenomenon, the foundation of the universe, is the awesome conflict between blood and environment. In other words, man dealing with, or the different races dealing with their physical environment, the bad weather, a famine, whatever it happens to be. And between blood and blood, the different races competing for resources as collective entities. As soon as we recognize those awesome conflicts as the ultimate phenomenon beyond which we are not permitted to probe, a new and richly colored picture of human history appears. So that's the foundation. It's not the class like Marx said, which is based on economic conditions, which are predicated off of private property relations. It's the race. It's the blood itself. That's the bedrock of humanity, is race. That's how serious this myth is. This recognition immediately brings with it the knowledge, feels like taking the bite from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This recognition immediately brings with it the knowledge that the struggle of the blood and the intuitive awareness of life's mystique are simply two aspects of the same thing. Race is the counterpart of soul. Pretty bold right there, right? So the struggle, the knowledge that you get by waking up to the woke Nazi program is that the struggle of blood and the intuitive awareness of life's mystique are simply two aspects of the same thing. Race is the counterpart of soul. The entire racial property is an intrinsic value. It has no relationship to dogmatic materialists who see only discrete events in time and space without experiencing these as the greatest and most profound of all secrets. So let it be absolutely dispelled that this is in any way secular at all. And this is maybe why you see the attacks on secularism being so vigorous, because this is a strong religious orientation. And I'm not saying that the thing that people are orienting toward necessarily is this same myth. We would have a myth of the 21st century instead of a myth of the 20th century. It would be somewhat different than this. It would be very America-centric rather than European-centric, but the general structure is likely to be the same. Racial history, he says, is therefore simultaneously natural history and soul mystique. Racial history is therefore simultaneously natural history and soul mystique. Soul mystique. It's amazing. The history of the religion of the blood, however, is conversely the great world story of the rise and fall of peoples, their heroes and thinkers, their inventors and artists. So when he says we need to rewrite history, it's going to be rewritten around a myth. That myth is the religion of the blood, which is this idea that the firmament of human experience, not just in body, but also in soul, is racial. That is the myth around which the Nazis organized and the appeal to a false tradition that allowed them to pretend to be right-wing. The next section, or first real section of this chapter, is titled A New Vision of History. Again, the same themes keep coming up. I won't belabor the point. Today, he says, historical vision can see deeper into the past than was imaginable at an earlier time. The monuments of all peoples now lie spread out before us, and excavations of the very oldest examples of pictorial art allow a comparison of the driving forces of cultures. The myths from Iceland to Polynesia have been collected, and the Mayan treasures in large part unearthed. Furthermore, modern geology enables us to draw maps as things were tens of thousands of years ago. Underwater exploration has raised solid masses of lava from great depths of the Atlantic Ocean, the summits of suddenly submerged mountains whose valleys once held great cultures before one or several horrible catastrophes destroyed them. So he's looking at these. So I have this whole theory that what's going on through the second half of the 19th century, in particular in the first half of the 20th century, first quarter at least of the 20th century or third, is that the scientific revolution actually properly took off, and a bunch of idiots got a hold of scientific ideas and did something dumb with them. I mean, in our day, we got the whole chemtrail thing. We got the whole. You could go down the list, right, of all these things, aliens. All kinds of bizarre stuff, and technologies beyond what people, beyond what's real. And here you're looking at geology saying, oh, wow, there's lava under the Atlantic Ocean. There must have been civilizations there, instead of, maybe just a rift in two tectonic plates. But at any rate, he's quite literal about the thing under the ocean. He didn't bring that up for no reason. He says, geographers depict for us continental masses between North America and Europe, whose fragments we see in Iceland and Greenland. On Novaya Zemlya In one area of the far north, ancient water lines are revealed more than 100 meters above the present ones. These suggest that the North Pole has shifted and that a much milder climate once prevailed in the Arctic. It might or it might not. I asked Grok about some of these points as I went through, and I don't remember what it said about this, but virtually invariably it said that Rosenberg made that up. So that's Grok. I'm not going to try to defend it, but I'm going to say that no, it's like every single time I'm like, did Alfred Rosenberg get this part right? And he's like, Grok, not he. Grok is like, no, Alfred Rosenberg did not get that absolutely right. In fact, he just made that up. Or it was based off of this and he got it completely wrong. So what he says here, you need not take too seriously. He was making shit up. And I say shit very deliberately here because it's not good stuff. It's bad stuff. It's shit. But it gets better, right? So you're already kind of, you're feeling where this is going, right? You're feeling it out. I know you're still offended that I said chemtrails and aliens and stuff. But it's kind of in the same group of people who are really into that stuff. We have another thing they're really into sometimes, right? So now we're talking about the North Pole has shifted and a much milder climate once prevailed in the Arctic. I wonder what he's about to talk about. Did you guess it? Did you guess it? 3, 2, 1. All in all, Rosenberg writes, the old legends of Atlantis may appear in a new light. It seems far from impossible. Notice he's rewriting history based on something that seems far from impossible. It seems far from impossible that in areas over which the Atlantic waves roll and giant icebergs float, a flourishing continent once rose above the waters, and upon it a creative race produced a far-reaching culture, sending its children out into the world as seafarers and warriors. So he's saying, yeah, probably Atlantis, based on the fact that the water level used to be 100 meters higher than it is today, not lower. Anyway, there's a volcano, so it must have sunk in a cataclysm. But he says he's got to hedge this one. It's a bit far. But even if this Atlantis hypothesis should prove untenable, a prehistoric Nordic cultural center must be assumed. There's the basis of the whole friggin' myth. Where is it? What is it based on? It must be assumed. It's not based on anything. Must be assumed. But if if they're not really from Atlantis, there must have been something. A prehistoric Nordic cultural center must still be assumed. That's the foundation of the Aryan peoples, by the way. This is his myth. We have long since been forced to abandon the theory of an identical independent origin of myths, art, and religious forms among all peoples. On the contrary, the strongly substantiated proof of the frequent traveling of sagas... On the contrary, the strongly substantiated proof of the frequent traveling of sagas from people to people and their taking root among many different groups shows that the majority of basic myths have a fixed point of radiation, their place of creation. Thus, in their outward form, they are only comprehensible on the basis of a completely distinct point of origin, and the migrations of races also became a certainty in the most prehistoric times. So, all the myths radiate from a fixed point. The solar myth, he says, with all of its ramifications, did not arise spontaneously as a stage of general development, but was born where the sun's appearance must have been a cosmic event of profoundest significance. That is, in the far north. There's a lot just like getting asserted here. So there's a solar myth. That's the basis for all of the major important religions, as he's going to see it, the solar myth. And people didn't, all recognize independently that the sun's really freaking important. It must have been that there was some culture as a single point of origin where the sun's appearance must have been a cosmic event of profoundest significance, and that only could be, he says, in the far north. Only there would the year be sharply divided into two halves, and only there would the sun represent a certainty in man's innermost being of the life-renewing, primally creative substance of the world. And so today, the long-derided hypothesis becomes a probability. not a certainty, a probability, namely that from a northern center of creation, which, without postulating an actual submerged Atlantic continent we may call Atlantis, swarms of warriors once fanned out in obedience to the ever-renewed and incarnate Nordic longing for distance to conquer and space to shape. So he's just invented a people that were in a land that, even if it really wasn't Atlantis, we're going to call it Atlantis, and they came out from the far north because they had the belief in the sun myth, and they brought that everywhere because the sun is so much more important in Atlantis and the far north, which was more temperate at the time, and somehow went under the ocean because of a volcano. And they swarmed out how? As swarms of warriors in obedience to what? Their blood. The ever-renewed and incarnate Nordic longing for distance to conquer and space to shape. Naturally imperialistic, naturally creative. These currents of Atlantic men, moved by water in their swan and dragon ships, into the Mediterranean and to Africa, by land over Central Asia to Kucha, and perhaps even to China, over North Africa, to the south of our own European continent. And so Kucha, it says in the footnotes, is an ancient Buddhist kingdom now located in present-day China. Ahura Mazda says to Zoroaster, well, that's interesting. That's really interesting. So Zoroaster, circa 1200 BC, or Zarathustra, was an ancient Iranian prophet and religious teacher who founded the movement known as Zoroastrianism. In his theology, Ahura Mazda, literally Lord of Wisdom, was the highest god. Hence, this god was also associated with light. James Lindsay was right. Okay, so one of the things that we'll come back to the book. One of the things that I've been trashed for, I mean just dragged for, by the woke right, is having talked about the fact that there's something in woke that evokes the dualistic belief system of Zoroastrianism. I've been trashed. Aryan McIntyre, not his real name, always goes to the signature to mock me is that I'm saying that something in woke is a Zoroastrian demon, or that woke is a Zoroastrian demon, or that woke right is a Zoroastrian demon. He's always making fun of this Zoroastrian thing, and that's because the Zoroastrian belief is that this Ahura Mazda, or the high god or whatever, is split into two forms, which appears in two formulations, one of which is called Ormazd, and that's the all-good side, and one is called Ahriman, which is the all-bad side. Ahriman becomes actually the inspiration for Satan in post-exilic Jews, the Jews when they came, or the Israelites when they were in exile. So we're talking like Book of Isaiah times, so we're talking like 800 BC. When they were in exile, and just before that, when they were in exile, they encountered these Persian beliefs of Zoroaster, 1200 BC approximately. They encountered these beliefs, and these beliefs were eschatological. They had this character, Ahriman, that is this all bad thing, and then Satan comes out of this as he's articulated in the Hebrew Bible, in the post-exilic writings. For example, Isaiah, which actually covers exactly this stuff, which is also one of the first texts that's sort of prophetic in pointing toward kind of eschatological things. So really interesting that Zoroaster is brought up here. But then there's another point to this that's worth bringing up. Because Zoroaster, who is kind of like the Christ figure, or like the central religious personage of the Zoroastrian religion, is also called Zarathustra, which is most famously a name that you've heard from Nietzsche, which is Thus Spake Zarathustra, this epic kind of weird thing he wrote, where Zarathustra comes out and is going to teach people to be the Superman. He comes out from his cave, sees the sunlight, and as goes down, he's going to teach people to be the Übermensch, the Superman, which is, of course, inspirational to the Nazis, this idea of becoming the Übermensch. And the way that Zarathustra indicates your elevation to Superman status is by transcending morality, as though morality is a prison that limits man and keeps him from reaching his full potential, the Superman. And so you have this really weird idea happening here, that this is being invoked in Germany post-Nietzsche. I'll also add that our favorite postmodernist, Michel Foucault, was a Nietzschean, even more than he was a Marxist. You could actually see his project as largely bringing together Nietzsche and Marx. And it's pretty soundly arguable that Foucault envisioned himself as the Nietzschean Übermensch, Zarathustra, who has renounced morality and will live an amoral life and thus a superior life to everyone else. So the first of the things that that Rosenberg invokes to explain the myth of blood is Zoroastrianism. Ahura Mazda says to Zoroaster, quote, "Only once in the year does one see the rising and setting of stars and sun and moon, and the inhabitants hold to be a day what is a year," end quote. So that's supposed to be proof that Zoroaster must, or Ahura Mazda must have been talking about, this sun myth must have come from a far northern climate. He says, "For the Persian god of light, this must be a distant memory of the Nordic homeland. Only in the far north do day and night each last 6 months. The Mahabharata," I said that wrong, Mahabharata, there's a lot of Mahabharatas or whatever, I don't care, reports of the Indian hero Aryan that during his visit to the mountain of Meru, the sun and moon daily passed around from left to right. Such an idea could never have originated in the tropical south, for only in the far north does the sun disk roll along the horizon. A prayer is also addressed to the Indian Adityas, quote, "May the long darkness not come over us," end quote, and it is complained of the bright Agni that he had tarried, quote, "too much in the long darkness," end quote, all of which can only be attributed to the long Hyperborean night, in other words, far northern night. Appearing together with these primeval Aryan Atlantic memories, notice now that Aryan has just slid in there, that's who came from Atlantis, and that's, the Zoroastrians were the Persians, were the Aryans, I'm just saying. Appearing together with these primeval Aryan Atlantic memories are those cult allegories, costumes, and carvings that are understandable only in terms of Nordic origin. In pre-dynastic Egypt, we find the Nordic boat with its swan neck and trefoil decor, but the rowers are the later ruling Amorites, already recognized by Archibald Sayce as fair-skinned and blue-eyed. They once traveled North Africa as a strictly homogeneous hunter clan which gradually defeated the entire land. They then migrated somewhat further across Syria and toward the future site of Babylon. The Berbers, among whom even today one finds light skins and blue eyes, do not go back to the Vandal invasions of the 5th century AD, but rather to the prehistoric Atlantic Nordic human wave. There's no proof that that wave ever existed. He just keeps asserting it based off of his interpretation of some myths. The Kabyle huntsmen, I don't know if I said that right, Kabyle huntsmen, for example, are to no small degree still wholly Nordic. Therefore, the blonde Berbers in the region of Constantinople comprise 10% of the population. At Jebel Shashor, they are even more numerous. The ruling stratum of the ancient Egyptians reveals significantly finer features than the subject people. These Hamites are apparently a crossbreed of the Atlanteans and the Negroid Aboriginal population. So, okay, they're Hamites. And so I asked Grok about this, and he says, Grok said that this is just very elaborate, points of reality and about myths and things being just kind of projected into a made-up story. Suddenly, he says, around 2400 BC, reliefs of men with fair skin, reddish blonde hair, and blue eyes begin to appear. These are the, quote, blonde Libyans, end quote, of whom Pausanias later reports. In the tomb paintings at Thebes, we find 4 races of Egypt represented: Asiatics, Negroids, Libyans, and Egyptians. The last are depicted with reddish pigmentation. The Libyans, on the other hand, are always shown bearded with blue eyes and white skins. pure Nordic types are shown on a grave of the Senja dynasty, in the woman on the pylon of Horhem at Karnak, by the swan boat people on the temple relief at Medinet Habu in Egypt, and by the Saqqarai who founded Phoenician sea travel. Light-skinned men with golden hair are shown on the tombs at the Medinet Ghurab. In the most recent excavations in 1927, the mastabas at the Pyramid of Cheops, the Princess and Queen Marasank 111, it's the third probably is what it's supposed to be, were found depicted with blonde hair. Queen Nitocris BC 2180, legendary and surrounded by myths, is likewise always said to have been a blonde. All of these are racial memories of a prehistoric Nordic tradition in North Africa. The light-skinned Amorites founded Jerusalem, and they formed the Nordic thread in later Galilee, that is, in the pagan region whence Jesus is said to have come. The Amorites were then augmented by the Philistines, who also brought to Syria hitherto unknown Nordic ship designs with axe and trefoil as the stem symbols. Okay, so a short commentary, because we're going to skip. I'm going to read a little bit from the different sections between here and the part about Christianity, but I'm going to skip to the part about Christianity because I see this podcast as an extension. Now that you've heard the myth of blood, I see this podcast as an extension of the story about positive Christianity, and I really want to make it very clear what a low opinion Rosenberg has of Christians. But notice the light-skinned Amorites founded Jerusalem, and they formed the Nordic thread in later Galilee, that is in the pagan region whence Jesus is said to have come. So this is going to be their positive Christianity argument, is that Jesus is actually a Nordic who didn't belong to the Levantine Jews. He's not actually really Jewish. He's actually a Nordic who happened to be in that region. And that way they can write out Jesus's Jewishness and write in that he is actually a representative of them, of the Aryans, who are ultimately Nordic, who were in some sense, in their aim to conquest and shape the world, had gone everywhere, and that Jesus is actually, all of his genealogies of Jesus in the Bible are actually proving that he was actually a Nordic. And that's what made him different, and that's what made Christianity come about. But it's funny because he's saying all that to capture the Christians in his positive Christianity movement, where he's making also very, very, very clear that he does not like Christianity. Now, this goes, the next part of the book for 40 pages or so, goes through Aryan migrations into different areas and what happened. And I'll touch upon them as I scroll, because I have to get like 40 pages down. But Aryan migrations into India comes first. It is still unclear where the prehistoric homeland of the Nordic race lies. It's called Made Up. As the South Atlanteans descended over North Africa and Southern Asia, so the North Atlanteans must have carried the sun god from Europe to Mesopotamia, and even to the Sumerians, whose yearly calendar had once begun on the day of the winter solstice. The most recent investigations in Iceland and Scotland indicate a possible Stone Age immigration. The ancient Irish ideal of beauty was of milk-white skin and blonde hair. This was abandoned later with the arrival of a dark, round-headed race. Much remains obscure. Perhaps only future investigations will be able to establish whether the oldest cult symbols, the first rock drawings of the Stone Age, were also the basis for the pre-dynastic Egyptian linear script. And it goes on and on like this. Is there anything else really important? When the first great Nordic wave, well, there's the mention of the Germanic. These migration periods, the legendary march of the Atlanteans across North Africa, Persia, and India, followed by the Dorians, Macedonians, and Italic tribes, and the diffusion of the Germanic folkish migration culminated in the colonizing of the world by the Germanic West. So Germany is going to be located as the center of this project and its success. When the first great Nordic wave rolled over the high mountains into India, it had already passed through many hostile races, Almost instinctively, the Indo-Aryans separated themselves from the dark alien peoples they encountered. The caste institution was the outcome of this instinctive aversion. Varna means caste, but it also means color. The fair Aryans thus linked themselves to an acceptable image of the human type and created a gulf between themselves as conquerors and the black-brown natives of pre-Aryan India. According to this opposition of blood and blood, the Aryans evolved a worldview which, for the depth and range, cannot be surpassed by any philosophy even today, although admittedly this was only after long battle against the constantly intruding ideas of the racially inferior Aborigines. So he's arguing that the Indians basically maxed out the system, which is a caste system, a racial caste system. And I'm not going to go through all the rest of this India stuff. The long and short is, though, that they had the wrong idea about how people really are, and therefore they allowed contamination, and they had their downfall. It goes like this. So I want to start. I don't want to go too far into this, but prayer, which was the true with the true Brahman was only a powerful elevation of the heart, became an incantation to compel gods by magic. So prayer lost its connection to the caste system and to race and to blood, therefore it became an incantation, and it was only about a powerful elevation of the heart. So they're getting it wrong. They're allowing something to corrupt their great system that came from the Aryans that conquered the black and brown-skinned Aborigines. In the midst of this murky process, the Atman, soul doctrine, appeared to light a ray of hope. It was not an act of psychological development, which would be utterly meaningless, but represented a new awakening of the Aryan soul in the face of the superstitious and magical beliefs of the subjugated non-Aryans. This interpretation is at once confirmed when it is established that the great doctrine of personal value of the spirit, devoid of magic and the demonic, originated in the courts of the kings and was diffused from the warrior class. Although the Brahmins were later to become the teachers of this new idea of essential oneness of the world soul and the individual soul, they were never able to conceal the origin of the new concept. Thus it happened that instruction concerning Atman is given, blah, blah, blah. Thanks to this aristocratic reassertion, the non-Aryan magic cult retreated further and further and did not proliferate again until later, when racial decay overtook even the India of the Kshatriyas. And so, as a born master, the Indian felt his individual soul expand into the Atman that pervaded the entire universe and lived within his own chest as his innermost self. The concept of an impersonal nature, rich and virtually all-knowing, could not divorce him from this metaphysical union. An active life, which was always demanded as an unavoidable duty of the world-renouncing thinker, gave more and more status to the aim of journeying into the universe of the soul. This transition to the pure light of knowledge led to the noble attempt to, in italics, overcome nature through reason. There is no doubt that many Indians, as individual personalities and aristocrats, were successful in this quest, but for later men, only the teaching remained devoid of its vital racial prerequisite. Soon the rich blood-based meaning of Varna was entirely lost. And so you can hear how he's claiming that they lost the foundation of blood, and therefore their ability to separate superior from inferior fell away. The later Indian did not comprehend the threefold significance of blood, self, and universe. He only saw the last two, self and universe, and he perished in the attempt at an isolated self-contemplation amidst racial pollution, whose modern products are wretched mongrels seeking healing for their crippled existence in the waters of the Ganges. And this is the story. I'm not going to read any more of this, except the late Indian monist came to see nature as something unreal, an evil dream. The only reality for him is the world soul, Brahman, and its eternal recurrence in the individual soul, Atman. With this turning away from nature in general, the once clear idea and concept of race became ever hazier. Philosophic dogma uprooted instinct from its earthly basis. If the only reality is the world soul, and if Atman is essentially one with it, then individuality vanishes and an undifferentiated universal oneness is achieved. The result was that Indian thought ceased to be creative, it grew rigid, in crept the dark alien blood of the swarthy Shudras, who were now thought of as equally valuable bearers of Atman. Okay, so the untouchables also were seen as carriers of the individual soul, and basically the entire civilization fell apart because it wasn't being racially based and segregating any longer. Thus, the original concept of the identity of caste and race was destroyed. Bastardization was inevitable. And he goes on to talk about how basically they fell apart as a result. Aryan blood flowed out and trickled away. Only here and there where the dark soil of ancient India sucks it up does it still fertilize, but it leaves only a cultivated philosophical and technical orthodoxy that in its later insane distortion rules Hindu life today. We must not short-sightedly assert that the Indian first polluted his race, then surrendered his personality. It is rather the case that a metaphysical process took place, and that this was manifested in a passionate yearning for the abolition of dualism as well as the reciprocally conditioning lower forms of polarity. Viewed from the outside, philosophical acceptance of an equation of Atman with Brahman engendered racial decay. In other cultures, this decay was not derived from the establishment of a pervasive philosophy, but was simply the result of uninterrupted miscegenation among two or more races. In such cases, the essential characteristics of the various races were neither elevated nor strengthened, but ended in mutual annihilation. I read through a fair amount of the Indian one here because I think it's instructive for... It allows me to just say, he tells this same story over and over again, whether it's the Indians, whether it's the Middle East is next, whether it's the Persians, and they're actual Aryans, as they were called, and so Zoroastrians, I'll touch on them actually, whether it's the Greeks, whether it's different people within the Greeks, whether it's the Romans, or whoever else. It's the same story over and over again. I'm going to kind of touch on these things quickly. I'm not going to read much, a little bit about the Zoroastrian part because it's interesting, and then we're going to skip down to his views on Christianity. So the Middle East, from the 6th century BC on, which really the 12th century BC, actually, but whatever. It even says that in the footnote from the editor. Most scholars place this earlier in history at the 1200s. But from the 6th century BC on, Iran underwent a vast expansion by Aryan Persians. Under Erasmes, 400s BC, date, I don't know, there arose one of the greatest personalities of Indo-European history, Spitama, Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. Concerned about the fate of the Aryan minority, he developed an idea that is only now beginning to revive in the Nordic West, protecting the race by endogamy. It's a fancy word. It means marrying within kin. So Zoroaster is credited with the idea of racially protecting your people through inbreeding. Okay, so concerned with the fate of the Aryan minority, he developed an idea that is now only beginning to revive in the Nordic West, by which he means Nazi Germany. Protecting the race by endogamy within kin, that is, marriage within the tribe or clan. But since the Aryan ruling aristocracy were sparsely scattered, Zoroaster tried to reinforce this imperative by creating an ideologically bound community of faith. Ahura Mazda, the eternal god of light, became a cosmic idea, the divine protector of Aryans everywhere. He had no special abode or temple like the gods of the Orient, and even of later Rome. He was simply the holy witness of perfection. His enemy is the dark Ahriman, who is locked in a struggle with him for world domination. This is a truly Nordic Aryan concept of Zoroaster. In this struggle, we must fight on the side of Ahura Mazda, just as the Einherjar, soldiers in Valhalla would fight for Odin against the Fenris wolf and the Midgard serpent. We must not, therefore, withdraw into world-renouncing contemplation and asceticism. We must see ourselves as the struggling bearers of a world-preserving idea. We must arouse and arm all the creative powers of the human soul. Whether as thinkers or active creators, we must always serve what is highest. Psh, that's the race, by the way, the blood. Wherever we go, we serve the creative principle. When we sow and reap, when we are true to ourselves, when we consider a handshake as an inviolable oath. The Vendidad epitomizes all this in the sublime words, quote, "Whoever sows grain sows saintliness." But, he says, struggling humanity is surrounded by evil and temptation. To oppose these forces successfully, Zoroaster invokes the Aryan blood that calls upon every Persian to serve the god of light. After death, good and evil are separated forever. In a final struggle, Ahura Mazda defeats Ahriman and constructs his kingdom of peace. For a while, the Persians derived great strength from this splendid religious epic, but despite such a heroic attempt, the dilution of Aryan blood in Asia could not be stemmed, and the great Persian kingdom declined. Yet Zoroaster's spirit and his myth continued to influence the greater world. The Jews, for example, adopted Ahriman as Satan and evolved their own entirely artificial system of racial admixture out of a Persian system devised to preserve racial purity. P.S. At least Grok says that is not what Zoroaster created. That is not how the system actually worked. There were other reasons for what was going on there. But here you see him saying the Jews stole the Zoroastrian idea and then used it wrongly to preserve their own race, which of course is one of those things Hitler rants about all the time in Mein Kampf, is that the Jews preserve their own race by marrying Jews preferentially, but they won't allow other people to preserve their own races, such as the Germans or whatever. So it's like being jealous of racial homogenization or something. Anyway, this was combined with an obligation-ridden religious law that was, of course, wholly Jewish. The Christian church appropriated the Persian idea of a savior as a prince of peace. The I don't know how to say that, Kaushiach or Mosiah in Hebrew, although adulterated with the Jewish idea of a Messiah. Today, in the heart of Northern Europe, the same racial soul idea has awakened to heightened consciousness as was taught by Zoroaster. Nordic self-awareness and Nordic racial discipline are the answer today to the Levantine East, which has diffused itself throughout Europe in the form of Jewry and varieties of faceless ecumenicalism. Persian culture was a grafting upon a Semitic Oriental trunk. As the commerce and money power of the lower races began to acquire material influence, power, and honors, the graft began to decompose. The kin marriage imperative was forgotten, and the equalizing of all races necessarily led to bastardization. And so, cut into the rock walls of Behistun on the order of a great Persian emperor, circa 500 BC, are the words, quote, "I, Darius, the great king of kings of the Aryan race," end quote. Today, Iranian mule drivers pass uncomprehendingly by this wall, a sign to the multitude that personality is born and dies with the race. So I hope that gave you a real taste, but also I think it gives some color as to why they went bananas when I started saying things about Zoroastrianism, because at least the ones of them that are caught up on this racialist idea, which is prominent in the woke right, may know, I don't know if they've read this or things derivative to this, but they may know that the Zoroastrian thing is kind of central to this particular myth, but then they might also know that that Rosenberg misappropriated that history to write this in this book or something. I don't know what they know. All I know is they flipped out like crazy over me mentioning Zoroastrian stuff and Ahriman. And then here it pops up in this book saying that Zoroaster is the one who comes up with the idea that the Aryans can preserve themselves by endogamy of kin, so that marriage only within, as the Germans would have it, the folk, which became a Nazi law. The next section is racial struggle in Greece. The dream of Nordic man was realized most beautifully in Hellas, that is in Greece. Wave upon wave came from the Danube Valley and overlaid the Aryan population of mixed Aryan and non-Aryan immigrants, bringing fresh creative powers. I'm not going to read it. It goes on and on about this. And kind of the big picture point is that Apollo and Athena, Pallas Apollo and Pallas Athena, are Nordic sun gods, male and female, sun and moon, and that they are the true Greek mythology and religion that then later got contaminated by a bunch of goofy gods. Eventually Apollo gets turned into Dionysus, and Greek culture goes straight to crap by same kinds of pollution, lots of Levantine pollution, lots of people coming in from the Near East, into Greece, some from Africa, polluting the Aryans, and the whole thing starts to fall apart. There's a very long discussion, actually, of the so-called, I think it's pronounced, but who knows, Hetairai, which are prostitutes. So basically these like ceremonial prostitutes, which I think were supposed to be a good idea at first, but then because they're prostitutes, made everything polluted, made everything really bad. But it also uses that as the justification that basically their society kind of degenerated because it was run by a matriarchy rather than a patriarchy that was going to be ultimately run by a brothel or a whorehouse. There is a lot of interesting stuff in this, but I'm not going to read it, at least in this episode. So Apollo versus Dionysus, that's what I was just saying, is that Dionysus replaces Apollo as Greece degenerates and leaves its Hellenic, stronger background. The Phoenician influence is coming in. Dionysian religion replaces it. The emphasis on Apollo's radiant virility is melded with Hetairai, so the prostitutes' ecstasy. Dionysus' law of unbridled sexual indulgence signifies the unhindered racial mixing between the Hellenes and all types and varieties of the Near East. The formerly man-hating Amazons reappear as crazed Maenads. The Apollonian marriage principle is again broken since the character of Sabazios is wholly oriented toward the female. The male sex begins to lose its identity. Men participate in the Dionysian festivities, but only dressed as women. From this Near Eastern racial pollution, the Dionysian bastardy extended itself westward until it dominated the entire Mediterranean. In Rome, the Dionysians particularly multiplied among the criminal classes, blah, blah, blah. Only in Hellas did the radiant Apollonian principle mastering chaos still prevail. And so, same theme, right? You get the same picture. Then the idea is, however, what he and others overlook is that Zeus Apollo represented the spiritual imperative of the Nordic Greek blood, whereas the hetera lifestyle or the prostitute lifestyle is an expression of Near Eastern and African races. The mixing of myths and values was simultaneously a process of racial bastardization, and many Greek legends are the poetic allegories of the struggle between different racially determined souls. It goes on and on about Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans and similar terms. Basically, he's some kind of a bastard that's coming along and screwing everything up. I think he's North African. Rome, a Nordic foundation, is the next section. Lots about Rome. Same story, by the way. Exactly the same story. Just the corruptions happen for different reasons. Lessons from Rome. Even if we had lacked the more recent racial historical investigation, we would have been compelled to endorse this interpretation of Roman history. In the course of studying ancient Roman customs, myths, and definitions of law and the state in all areas, we see that the most ancient values, when confronted with those of Africa and the Near East, were suddenly or gradually transformed into their opposites, even while retaining their old nomenclature. So it's same story, right? That Rome basically gave in and racially polluted itself and allowed ideas to pollute it, and the Aryan element that founded it fell apart, and the whole thing eventually collapses. He spends a lot of time particularly on Etruscan decadence. So the Etruscans, who are in the Tuscany region, as we call it now, represent an extra important part of this story. He is not very positive toward them. Lots of alleged sexual degeneracy there that ends up tearing Rome apart. That's a very long section, actually. I'm still scrolling through this. It's a very long section. Then we get to Advent of Christianity, finally. So I'll read that last paragraph of Etruscan decadence, which closes the section on Rome. Such are the two worlds that tore apart the heart of Nordic man in the Middle Ages. On the one hand was the Near Eastern idea of a hideous hell the church adopted. On the other, the longing to be free, upright, and healthy. Only insofar as he is free can the Teuton be creative. Only where the insane terrors of witchcraft did not hold sway could the great centers of European culture flourish. This is where he's complaining about, in the Etruscan part, he's complaining about Dante and the depiction of Inferno. Lots, though, here in that section I maybe shouldn't skip. This is where he really starts trashing the popes. just kind of not look. I don't have something bookmarked, so I'll just read this one paragraph because I see that it mentions it. I don't know how into it goes. Musically untalented, lacking any poetic gifts, incapable of producing an organic architecture of their own, and without even the rudiments of philosophy, this Near Eastern people, meaning the Etruscans, devoted itself to the study of birds' entrails and to complex magical and sacrificial rites. Not without some technical ability, it was almost wholly dedicated to commerce, and because it was tenacious, it poisoned Roman blood and transmitted its obsession with hellish torments in the world to come to the churches. The ghastly and bestial demons became an enduring and effective tool of the popes, and through the conceptual world that had been poisoned by the Church of Rome, dominated our Middle Ages. Medieval art gives shocking testimony to this. One can see the proof of this even on the Isenheim altar, as well as the descents into hell by other artists. So, only when we have learned to recognize the utterly alien origins of these concepts and muster the resolution to rid ourselves of this diabolism will we have cast off the Middle Ages, Rosenberg says. But with our emancipation, the Roman Church, which is inextricably linked with the sadistic visions of the Etruscan hell, will collapse from within. So he's not a big fan of Catholicism, but let's read his take on the advent of Christianity and close this bad boy out. This is several pages long, though. Into this raceless stew that was now Rome came Christianity. That's a fun sentence, right? Its success is largely to be explained by its concept of a sinful world and redemption through grace, which was its natural complement. The doctrine of original sin would have been incomprehensible to a people whose racial identity was unadulterated. In such a people there dwells a secure confidence in itself and in its will, which it regards as destiny. So original sin is the result of racial pollution. This is much like how private property is the cause of the fall of man and communism. The doctrine of original sin. So without that doctrine, by the way, Christianity doesn't make any sense. Christ's sacrifice is to pay the price for original sin. The doctrine of original sin would have been incomprehensible to a people whose racial identity was unadulterated, he says. So if you had a racially unadulterated people, there's no original sin. So Christianity doesn't even make sense. In such a people, there dwells a secure confidence in itself and in its will, which it regards as destiny. So it doesn't need a savior. It has destiny. It knows that it's great. The concept of sin was as alien to the Homeric heroes as it was to the ancient Indians, the Germans of Tacitus, and the epics and sagas of Dietrich von Bern, circa 500s AD. Okay, so he's being very clear and explicit here. The Aryans don't sin. They are actually sinless because they're racially pure. They didn't do anything wrong. They're confident in who they are. There's not even an idea of sin. They don't think of themselves that way. They have a mandate to be able to do as they will, conquer the distances and create as they go. And it's an alien concept. The idea of sin itself is an alien concept to the Aryan. So you can see how the Nazi ideology regards the Aryan peoples, that they are sinless, elevated people who deserve to rule and they're not doing anything wrong because they're superior. He says an oppressive sense of sin. So listen, Christians, you can't align with this crap. Jews already know that, but come on, Christians. An oppressive sense of sin is a sure symptom of racial bastardy. There's you a sentence. So if you believe in sin, that you are a sinner, Christian, you believe that you are a sinner, that comes from, it is a sure symptom of your racial bastardy. Because if you were a real Aryan, you would be sinless. And if you were sinless, I bet you would act like you think you're sinless. Just soak in what these guys think of Christianity. Okay, so if the central premise of Christianity is in fact that you're a sinner who can be redeemed by grace through the sacrifice of Jesus. So you are a sinner. But that means that to be a Christian, you're admitting that you are a racial bastard in his myth of the blood, which means you're a mongrel, which means you're not an Aryan, which means you are contaminated. Race pollution, he says, shows itself in a number of ways: in an absence of clear direction in thought and action, and an inner self-doubt, and the feeling that existence is simply the wages of sin rather than the necessary and mysterious imperative of self-development. So there's a rejection of Genesis 3. The sense of personal depravity leads to a yearning for grace, and this is the only hope for the products of miscegenation. So you think this way because you're a racial bastard, not an Aryan. This reminds me of a lot of these theosophical branches. Theosophy doesn't really have any rules, so there's lots of branches that regard the narrative of it, they regard the redemption of self through kind of a Gnostic process as the recognition that you are actually sinless, that you are actually, in fact, in yourself as you are, the third person of the Godhead, if you divide it into a Trinity. And that you, man, are in that position, and that the claim of original sin or sin at all is an illusion that you can transcend by realizing it's not real. So therefore you are the divine already, you are sinless already, and this is just re-expressing itself, except that the sin is the mixing of the blood away from Aryanism. It was natural, therefore, he tells us, in whosoever the old Roman characters still lived, that a revulsion arose against the spread of Christianity, most especially as it represented a thoroughly proletarian and nihilistic political ethos. The grossly exaggerated accounts of bloody persecutions of Christians were not, in fact, attempts at suppression of conscience, as the church history claims. The Roman Forum was open to all gods, but rather aimed at the protection of the state against an existential political threat. See, Christians, you weren't really persecuted in Rome or by the Romans. You were totally free to do whatever you wanted, but you represented a political threat, and that's what they were really going after. It wasn't that you were being persecuted for your faith, like you like to believe, and the church says, and it wasn't really that bad. It's bigly exaggerated. That's what he's arguing. The church lied to make you guys think that you were this persecuted group under, say, Diocletian or whatever, and it's just kind of exaggerated and made up. You were and displaced. You were a political threat. Your faith didn't really have anything to do with it. They didn't care about you being Christian. He says it was reserved to the church in its Pauline Augustinian form to invent doctrinal councils and burning at the stake for the purpose of annihilating the spirit. Classical Nordic antiquity knew nothing of this, and the Germanic world has likewise always rebelled against this Levantine import. Ecclesiastical Christianity has made Emperor Diocletian, his reign 284 to 305 AD, it should be AD 284 to 305, I'm just saying, a particular target of its attacks. He was of lowly origins, though probably of part Germanic ancestry. So Diocletian was of Germanic ancestry probably, and of lowly origins. He had blue eyes and very white skin, that's very important, and was a man of personal integrity of the type admired by Marcus Aurelius. His family life was above reproach in all matters of state. Diocletian conducted himself with great moderation. He was opposed to all forms of oppression, favored religious toleration, and only authorized action against Egyptian tricksters, fortune tellers, and sorcerers. So take your persecution narratives from the 2nd century, or I guess 3rd century, and just throw them out. The Diocletian persecution didn't happen, guys. We're rewriting history. The Emperor Galenius had already given official recognition to the Christian cult, and Christian buildings were erected without interference. What initially disturbed an organic development, however, was the squabbles of the rival bishops. Diocletian excused his Christian soldiers from the pagan sacrifices and insisted only on military discipline. But it was precisely in this area that his authority was challenged by the leaders of the African church, so that recruits refused to perform their duties on the grounds of their Christianity. One such pacifist, remember the Nazis really hate pacifists, one such pacifist, despite friendly admonitions, persisted in his obduracy until at length he had to be executed for mutiny. Such threatening symptoms at last persuaded Diocletian to insist on the participation of Christians in state ceremonies of a religious nature. Even now, he did not generally punish Christians who refused to obey, but merely granted them discharges from military service. It's funny how this guy talking about Diocletian sounds like Daryl Cooper talking about Nazis. Oh, yeah, he didn't really want to kill the Jews. He just, had all these people in concentration camps, labor camps and stuff, and they couldn't feed them. It was logistical. It was a mercy, really. The only result was a stream of unmitigated abuse from the Christians, so it was the Christians' fault, not Diocletian persecuting them, whose factious mutual conflicts also menaced civil peace in other ways. Finally, the state took action in self-defense. Even now, Diocletian did not exact the death penalty, as he did in the case of some swindling merchants, but only reduced the rebellious to the status of the slave class. The outcome of this was rioting and arson directed against the emperor's palace itself, provocations by the Christian communities hitherto unmolested and which had become arrogant in consequence, followed one after another throughout the empire. The ensuing terrible persecutions of the Christians by the, quote, monster, Diocletian amounted to 9 rebellious bishops executed, and in Palestine, the center of the most violent resistance, a total of 80 death sentences actually carried out. By contrast, the supremely Christian Duke of Alba, circa 1570, slaughtered 100,000 heretics in the tiny Netherlands alone. So, basically your whole Roman persecution narrative of Christians is just a bunch of bullcrap. That's what Alfred Rosenberg is saying here in his rewritten history of the world. So if you didn't mind the Aryan, Zarathustra, all that crap part, if you didn't mind the Aryans in India and the caste system part, maybe this one touches your soul. The guy thinks you're lying about your own church history and what it means, and really just kind of exaggerating. And Diocletian was really moderate and good. Somewhere else in here he talks about how he came across, somebody, a statue or whatever, and he knew it was a Nordic because he had like a high brow and a long narrow nose and a perfectly formed mouth. And it feels very woke right when I read that. Maybe we'll run into it. I don't remember where it is. Only, he says, by re-examining these events is it possible to shake off the hypnotic effect of systematically falsified history. So the church falsified the history of the Roman persecutions, and we have to shake that off. It has a hypnotic effect. It's like an opium of the masses. Thus does Emperor Julian, quote, the apostate, reign 361 to 363, who also believed in equal rights for all the cults, appear in a new light, because he did not hesitate on the grounds of pious convictions to oppose the spokesman of God. He knew well what was involved when he wrote, quote, through the follies of the Galileans, our state was almost ruined, but now the gods be praised, it is saved. Therefore we shall honor the gods in every city in which there is still piety, end quote. This proved thoroughly justified, for no sooner had Christianity become the state religion under Constantine, who converted in 310, than the Old Testament spirit of hatred showed its hideous face. The Christians at once demanded the application of punishments prescribed in the Old Testament against the worship of idols. In Italy, with the exception of Rome itself, the temples of Jupiter were closed. We can sympathize with the despair of Julian, but at the same time we can see that the history of early Christianity needs rewriting, and that Bishop Eusebius, circa 300, is hardly a reliable source. Christianity, as it was introduced to Europe via the Roman Church, derives from a multitude of roots. This is not the place for a more detailed study of its sources. A few basic observations must suffice. To which there's your rewritten Christian history, guys. But he's not going to get too into it, but some points are going to be made, and the next section is called The Origins of Christian Theology. Buckle up, Christians. The great personality of Jesus Christ, he says, whatever form it might have taken originally, was distorted and confused immediately after his death with all the rubbish of Jewish and African life. In the Near East, Rome ruled with great firmness and exacted taxes efficiently. Accordingly, among their subject populations, there arose the desire for a liberator and a leader of the slaves, hence the legend of Christos. Beginning in Asia Minor, this Christos myth spread to Palestine, where it became linked with Jewish messianic yearnings and was finally attached to the personality of Jesus. Beside his own utterances, there were falsely attributed to him the words and doctrines of Near Eastern prophets, and ironically indeed in the form of an extension of ancient Aryan moral precepts. For example, the 9-commandment table that had already been appropriated by the Jews as their 10 commandments. In this manner, Galilee was joined with the whole Near East. So, okay, I don't think this guy likes you Christians. I think he thinks it's all fake. He sounds like a new atheist here, ranting, which is sort of funny. The Christian movement, he says, disrupting old forms seemed to be, let me just point out, because I didn't read all the Roman and Greek stuff, that he thinks that the old gods of both Roman and Greek structure, in particularly, like I said, Pallas Apollo, Pallas Athena in the Greek, and that would be like Sol Invictus or whatever in the Romans. It's also Apollo in Rome, right? Yeah, as the sun god. So these guys are the ancient Nordic sun religion from the Atlantis or whatever, and everything else, all this other stuff, polluted the crap out of it over time and made it worse and worse. And then you have this weird thing come in, these Christians with their actually sort of Jewish thing that's kind of stolen again from Zoroastrianism. The Zoroaster character of Jesus is like a theft, and then the Jews had already stolen some Zoroastrianism and their own race preserving ideologies, as he already argued. So his he's not in any way happy about what Christianity represents. It's all the rubbish of Jewish and African life, basically. Then to carry on, though, he's not positive about Paul either. The Christian movement, disrupting old forms, seemed to the Pharisee Saul, later St. Paul, to hold great promise of practical usefulness. So he was just cynically using this. In a sudden decision, which the footnote is his road to Damascus from Acts 9, his road to Damascus moment where he has a conversion. In a sudden decision, not in a sudden conversion or a sudden vision or whatever, in a sudden decision, Paul joined its ranks, and possessed by an unrestrained fanaticism, he preached international revolution against the Roman Empire. Despite all subsequent attempts at reform, his teaching still retained the Jewish spiritual basis, the Talmudic Oriental aspect of both the Catholic and the Lutheran churches. Well, so the Talmudic Oriental aspect of the Catholic and Lutheran churches notwithstanding, I'll just point out that the Talmud wasn't composed until some centuries after St. Paul. So the Talmud is not as old as people think. The Talmud is a series of commentaries on the Midrash. The Midrash is the laws that comes about actually well into what is called the Common Era, or in the 80 years after Christ. So this isn't some. Certainly, Paul wasn't Talmudic, but he didn't say Paul's Talmudic. I just want to make sure it's clear, though, that he's not calling Paul Talmudic, and Paul could not have been Talmudic. But despite all attempts at reform, Paul's teaching still retained the Jewish spiritual basis. So the Jewish spiritual basis he then refers to as the Talmudic Oriental aspect of both the Catholic and the Lutheran churches. But I'm just pointing out the Talmud came centuries later. This is anachronistic. It's not so great for a rewritten history of the world. Paul, he says, accomplished something that is never admitted in religious circles. He made the suppressed Jewish national rebellion internationally effective, thus paving the way for the further spread of racial chaos in the ancient world. So there's Paul for you. There's St. Paul. There's his view of Paul. He made the suppressed Jewish national rebellion. So the Jews had a national rebellion. Remember, AD 70, they get smashed for this rebellion. Okay, so he makes the suppressed Jewish national rebellion internationally effective. He spreads it to the Gentiles. He spreads it around to other people, but it's still the Jewish revolt. It's still Talmudic, as he said, in its spirit. Thus, what was the consequence of him bringing the Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire? Because remember, that's rooted in Nordic, Aryan, Atlantis people stuff. By bringing the rebellion to the Gentiles, he paved the way for what? The further spread of racial chaos in the ancient world. So it is Paul's fault that the racial chaos that tore down the ancient world came along. That's what he thinks of your religion, ladies and gentlemen. All those epistles of Paul writing to people are in the New Testament, in the Bible, are paving the way for the further spread of racial chaos in the ancient world. The Jews in Rome knew this very well when they offered their synagogues as places where he could make his proselytizing speeches. So he was working with the Jews in order to use their synagogues, because the Jews knew it would spread racial discord if he could do what he was doing, and then that would tear down the Roman Empire. So they were sinisterly plotting against the Roman Empire and letting Paul do the dirty work in the name of Christianity. This is crazy shit, man. The fact that Paul, despite occasional criticism of the Jews, knew quite well that he served a Jewish cause. Just soak it in, baby. All you noticers, you are amateur noticers. The fact that Paul, despite occasional criticism of the Jews, knew quite well that he served a Jewish cause. Christianity, guys, is to be seen, which using Christianity to push Judaic and Talmudic thinking into Europe and the Near East in order to tear them apart by undermining their racial basis in Aryanism. That's what we're talking about here, guys. Okay, so that can be proved in several all too candid passages in his letter. So first, Romans 9, 3 through 5, he quotes, "For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, and the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises, of whom we are the fathers, and from whom, according to the flesh, Christ came, who is over all, the eternally blessed God." And then Romans 11, 24 and 25, this is a famous one, right? "For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, who are natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened in Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." So this is the part that the Catholic Church often gets really worked up about, saying that, the next part right after that in Romans 11 is where he says, "Do not be arrogant against the root when you're the branch," and that part's not given here. But this is the part where I hear a lot of Catholics try to make the argument that the Jews who haven't accepted Jesus have been cut out of their own tree, and so therefore are not really part of that root either until they accept Jesus. Well, anyway, here's what Rosenberg has to say. "This is identical," he says, "to the teachings of the modern misbegotten sect of serious Bible students. The Gospel of John, which still retains an aristocratic spirit, strove to defend Christianity against this collective bastardization, Orientalization, and Judaization. About the year 150, Marcion, the Marcion heresy, how about that? Marcion. It's not Marcion, it's spelled Marcion, it's Marcion. About the year 150, Marcion, as in the Marcion heresy, who was a Greek, once again represented the Nordic idea of," he was a Gnostic. All right, and so a lot of times you'll hear that this woke right stuff is just a re-invocation of the Marcion heresy. Well, about the year 150, Marcion, who was a Greek, once again represented the Nordic idea of a world order based on organic tension and hierarchical structure. This was in direct contrast to the Semitic conception of a capricious God who exercised a boundless despotism. Marcion therefore rejected the Old Testament as a book of laws of an obviously false deity, that is, Gnostic. Similar efforts were made by a few of the Gnostics. That's the next sentence. But Rome, now racially polluted beyond redemption, was utterly committed to Africa and Syria and smothered the simple essence of Jesus with the accretions of late Roman goals of world empire and ecumenical church. The conflicts of the earliest centuries of our era cannot be understood except as struggles of racial souls against the hydra-headed racial chaos, which was Paul's fault. In this, the Near Eastern amalgam of superstition, insane magic, and sensual mysteries gathered to itself all that was chaotic, broken, and degenerate, thus infecting Christianity with that schismatic character that still afflicts it to this day. Thus, a servile religion, its true nature disguised through the misuse of the great personality of Jesus, entered Europe. Emergent Christianity, derived from a multiplicity of sources, demonstrated an astounding combination of abstract spirituality and demonic sorcery, as well as exceptional powers of infiltration, regardless of other currents that were assimilated in it. So whether Catholic or later Protestant, ladies and gentlemen, Alfred Rosenberg thinks you are demonic. in your Christianity, that it's fake, that it's a total disaster of a schismatic character that's destroyed the real Christian character, which of course I'm sure he knows because Jesus was a Nordic. As Chamberlain, that's Houston Stewart Chamberlain, by the way, speaking of the Foundations of the 19th Century, which is a book that not only Rosenberg but Hitler greatly admired. But as Chamberlain and Delitzsch, I think that's how you say his name, have already emphasized, there is not the slightest compelling reason to assume that Jesus was of Jewish origin. Sounds like things we hear today, even if he grew up in Jewish circles of thought. Some interesting research results can be found by Dr. Emil Jung in his book, The Historical Personality of Jesus, 1924. According to the Syrian Christian preacher Ephraim, 306 to 373, Jesus had a Danaite woman born from Dan as a mother and a Latin father. It sounds like Muslim stuff. Ephraim sees nothing dishonorable in this, adding, quote, Jesus thus derived his descent from two very great and famous people, motherly from the Syrians and the fatherly from the Romans, end quote. Ephraim assumes this knowledge is well known. There's a really interesting footnote here, which is very long. Despite Rosenberg's claim, there is considerable evidence that Jesus was, in fact, Jewish. He was a Jew from birth because both his father Joseph and his mother Mary were Jews. Joseph, we read, was, quote, of the house of David. And the Gospel of Matthew opens with a lengthy genealogy leading him from Abraham. Mary was a woman, quote, born under the law of Judaism, end quote, as given in Galatians, and she was a blood relative of Elizabeth of the tribe of Levi. Both parents attended Passover every year, and both, quote, performed everything according to the Jewish law of the Lord, end quote, and Jesus himself is repeatedly called Rabbi. He celebrated Passover, John 2:13. The Gospel of Matthew opens with these words, quote, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham, end quote. We read in Hebrews that, quote, it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, end quote. He regularly attended the local synagogue. Jesus himself told the people that he came, quote, to fulfill the Jewish law and the Jewish prophets, end quote, and called upon his followers to, quote, keep the 10 Commandments, end quote. He even claimed to be the Messiah, the Jewish Savior, John 4:26, and of course, everyone thought of him as, quote, King of the Jews, Matthew 2:2 and John 19:3. Paul recites his views, stating, quote, of the Israelites' race according to the flesh is the Christ, end quote, Romans 9:5. And in Galatians, Paul says that, quote, God sent forth his son born of woman, born under the Jewish law, end quote, Galatians 4:4. All this presumes, of course, that a historical Jesus, a flesh and blood human being, actually existed. The utter lack of contemporary evidence and lack of any evidence for decades after his supposed death suggests that no such man ever existed. That is, Jesus may well have been a fictional construction by Paul and or others, but we will set this possibility aside for the time being. Now, that last paragraph is super interesting. The guy writing this book is not a Christian either. He's probably an atheist. That's the only place I've ever seen that argument made is from atheists. And so here he is. He's like, no, Jesus was a Jew. So you have a guy who doesn't even believe in Christianity massively defending the idea Jesus was a Jewish against a Nazi who's saying, no, actually he wasn't. And it very, very much looks like, I don't know who this Ephraim, I should look him up. I bet you he's a Muslim because the Syrian Christian preacher, no. So he's a Christian preacher, Ephraim. This is the Muslim story of Jesus, is that he was born as that. So, yeah, cool, Rosenberg. Christians, these are not your people. Okay, so the idea of the Trinity, for example, Rosenberg says, was familiar to many Mediterranean people in the form of the Father, the Mother, and the Son. And in the precept, quote, everything divides threefold, end quote. The mother symbolized the fertile earth, the father the creative principle of light. Now, in place of the mother, there appears the Holy Ghost as a conscious retreat from the purely physical. Such was the Hagian Pneuma, the Holy Spirit of the Greeks, and the Prana of India. The spirituality and its emphasis were not rooted in a racial national ground conditioned by the polarity of organic life. Instead, it became a force without direction. Quote, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither man nor woman, end quote, wrote Paul to the Galatians 3:28. the Galatians being the last remnant of a great Celtic migration down the Danube Valley and into Asia Minor. That means Paul was rebuking the Galatians, or instructing the Galatians, and the Galatians were Aryans. On the basis of this nihilism, meaning that neither Jew nor Greek line, on the basis of this nihilism, which is the denial of everything organic, he then calls for a belief in Christ. This constituted a total rejection of all the culture-creating values of Greece and Rome, although, to be sure, Christianity adopted a degenerate form of such values and effected their disintegration. So Christianity is what destroyed Rome and Greece, because it took on this bastardized version and rejection of its culture-creating values, which came from the Aryans under the sun cults of Apollo. Thanks to its strongly exclusive character, Christianity was then able to gather all those who had lost direction. And the footnote says that this is echoing Nietzsche specifically. Do I want to read that whole footnote? No, not really. Christianity is part of the footnote. It says Christianity is a formula with which to outbid the subterranean cults of all kinds, those of Osiris, of the Great Mother, of Mithras, for example, and to unite them. In this insight lies the great genius of Paul. So this is a book alleging that, this is quoting from a book from Nietzsche, and where he's alleging basically that Paul was operating as Antichrist. And he's going to I was going to read it, but I'm not going to read it, but he's resurrecting the idea of Mithras, and Mithras is a Zoroastrian deity. All right, where did I leave off? A further step, Rosenberg tells us, toward the denial of natural life lay in the dogmatic assertion of the virgin birth. Yet this is commonly a part of a solar myth to be found among various peoples from northern Europe to the South Sea Islands. So notice that he's rejecting a Christian thing, but he's also appropriating it and saying, look, this is just one of these Nordic things being told incorrectly. But look at this theme that keeps coming up. I want to draw your attention to this. The denial of natural life, of organic this, of organic life, or of organic character or whatever. The denial of everything organic, natural, organic, right? So the Nazis are abandoning as completely unrealistic and inorganic, like we talked about earlier, the idea of Christianity. Christianity is not, it's an abstraction. It is not in tune with the real conditions of man. It's just like Marx. With Marx, the real conditions of man are obscured by the religion as the opium of the masses. And here, the real racial character of man is obscured by things like believing you're made in the image of God. Abstract spirituality, in fact, he says, however, was flanked on each side by all the magic of Asia Minor, Syria, and Africa. The demons that were driven out by Jesus and passed into the swine, Mark 5:1, Matthew 8:28. The calming of the stormy sea at his command, Mark 4:35, Luke 8:22. His certified resurrection from the dead, Mark 16. His ascent into heaven, Luke 24:51. All these were the real point of departure for falsified Christianity, and undoubtedly greatly strengthened the ability to endure much suffering. Thus the world did not proceed from the life of the Savior, soter, but from his death and its miraculous consequences. This is the single motif of the Pauline epistles. Goethe, on the contrary, held that it was the life of Christ which was important, not his death. In this, Goethe was attesting to the soul of the Germanic West expressed in positive Christianity, as opposed to negative Christianity based on priesthood and witch mania, and deriving from Etruscan Asiatic concepts like hell and demons and good and evil, and sin. As indicated earlier, it's misleading when our scholars represent the transformation of Greek life, and of Messiah. So if you're sinless, you don't need a Messiah, right? You don't need a Savior. You don't need redemption. You're above all of that, right? You're already past that. So that's one of these Asiatic concepts that they don't like, one of these Levantine concepts that was the Jewish Messiah thing that I read earlier. It's the idea of, of an anointed one that's going to save you, which they claimed was borrowed from the Persians, from the Zoroastrians. As indicated earlier, it's misleading when our scholars represent the transformation of Greek life as if there had been a development from, I don't even know how to say this word actually, chthonic, I think, chthonic gods to a deity of light. So it's subterranean, dark, underworld gods, chthonic gods to a deity of light. So let me reread that part. It's misleading when our scholars represent the transformation of Greek life as if there had been a development from the chthonic gods to a deity of light and from matriarchy to patriarchy. It is equally false when they speak of a naive popular outlook that later ascended to lofty thought. In reality, alongside the anti-chthonic struggle in the later predominance of intellectual doctrinal systems and the attempt to exert political restraint over the earlier and unconstrained ways, there occurs a drying up of creative racial powers. In the end, we have only the Platonic reaction that strove to artificially attain that which the blood alone was already too weak to achieve. The Nordic Greek, he tells us, recognized no separate priestly caste. His priests came from the aristocratic families. Singers and poets conveyed the deeds and the acts of Greek heroes and gods. He spends a lot of time talking about Homer, by the way. The free Greek spirit was as alien to dogmatism as was the earlier Indian and the later Teuton. Gymnastics and music were the substance of his education. These established the necessary prerequisites for the production of the hoplite, the citizen of the state. Only a Socrates, 430 BC, could preach such insanity as the idea that virtue could be taught and imparted to all men, all as in italics, an idea further refined by Plato. He who really understands the nature of the world of ideas must necessarily be virtuous. With the promulgation of such an individualistic and faceless worldview, the axe was truly struck at the roots of Greek life. So he's laying at the roots of the destruction of the Greeks, Socrates, by saying that virtue could be taught to anybody, that rather than just Aryans. Only the superior can learn virtue according to them. So when you hear the woke right saying that what's going to hold together their regime is going to be an insistence on virtue, that means being of the folk stock that they think they represent. It is a racial characteristic, at least for the Nazis. I don't know what these more modern people think. And so virtue is only accessible not to anybody, but only to the true national character in this kind of philosophy. And when you believe that anybody can learn to be virtuous, well, that's an individual and faceless worldview, and that's it. That's the axe struck at the roots of your society. At the same time, he tells us, this rootless intellectualism permitted the rebirth of all those Asiatic practices that had been put to flight by Apollonian Greek discipline. Here we can follow with absolute objectivity the alternating play that occurs between intellectualism and magic. Both reason and will, if not consciously, pursue the same goal. Both are true to nature, blood determined and organically conditioned. That means by evolutionary processes. To the degree to which the rational worldview becomes unsure of its validity because of the changed nature of those who represent it, it also becomes too narrow for rational constructs. At the same time, that part which is based on will degenerates into magic and the proliferation of one superstition after another. The result of the disintegration of the rational, willed racial soul is a worldview based on an intellectual, magical substructure, when it is not merely meaningless individualism and unbridled bastardy. In the former case, the Catholic Church and to a lesser extent Protestantism provide intellectual justifications for a magical belief. Late Hellenism offers an example of the latter. So I think you need to understand that the Nazis were not fans of Christianity or the Catholic Church or any of this. And the reason is because it's all really about this rational, willed racial soul. And if you don't have that, as the Christians don't, then you're going to be operating on an intellectual, magical substructure or meaningless individualism and unbridled bastardy. So race or those choices. So he gives remember, you may have forgotten because we're talking about Greece now, but we're still talking about Christianity. Negative and positive Christianity, he says, were locked in conflict from the beginning, and that conflict is today being waged with ever more bitterness. The negative type emphasizes its Levantine Etruscan tradition, so that's Jewish and things like believing in things like hell and demons. The negative type emphasizes its Levantine Etruscan tradition, its abstract dogmas and hoary old customs, lots of priest stuff. The positive type consciously calls upon the Nordic blood to awaken, just as in their simple innocence the first Teutons did when they pressed into Italy, bringing renewed vigor to that sick land. Like a mighty and awesome primordial destiny, the Cimbri had once stormed in from the north. The Cimbri were a Germanic tribe that attacked Rome around 100 BC. An initial repulse could not stay the Nordic Celts and Teutons from repeatedly pressing upon the frontiers of Rome. In campaign after campaign, the military skill of the Romans proved ineffectual against the rude strength of a young people. Giant, blonde Germanic slaves began to appear on the streets of Rome, and the Germanic ideal of beauty became fashionable among a decadent people bereft of all ideals of their own. Free Teutons were also soon frequent in Rome. More and more, the Caesars came to depend for support on the loyalty of the Germanic soldiery, and yet at the same time the Germans came to constitute the greatest threat to the existence of the wretched state, now without values of its own. By imposing fines on bachelors, subsidizing marriage and public welfare, Augustus attempted to regenerate his own people. It was in vain. Teutons were instrumental in the election of Claudius, of Galba, and of Vitellius. Marcus Aurelius sent his Teutonic prisoners from Vienna to Italy, where instead of making them into gladiators, he had them farm the long-abandoned soil. By the time of Constantine, the Roman army was almost entirely Germanic. Whoever cannot see racial forces at work here must be blind to all historical processes. It is patently obvious that both decomposition and rebirth are present in this. The regenerative process continues past Constantine to Stilicho, Alaric, Ricimer, Odoacer, Theodoric, and the Langobards, 600 to 800 AD, and to the Normans. These last named started by establishing a kingdom in the south that reached its apogee under the incomparable Frederick II, whose Sicilian kingdom became the first secular world state and whose provinces were settled by German nobility. That's circa 1225. I think we've gone past the Christian part for the most part, but he's just kind of rambling again about how here we have, well, I'll just finish it, whatever. Then this process of Nordicizing Italy, the work of Theodoric the Great, 475 to 526 in his reign, was particularly significant. For more than 30 years, this strong yet generous and gentle ruler governed Italy. While Marcus Aurelius and Constantine had begun, he continued. The Teutonic settlers now became not merely tenant farmers and smallholders, but also owners of large estates. 1/3 of all the landed property passed into the hands of the Germanic soldiery. Although unfortunately widely dispersed, nevertheless more than 200,000 Germanic families settled in Tuscany and around Ravenna and Venice. Once again, Nordic hands drove the plow through the soil of Middle Italy, making the hitherto impoverished and desolate land fruitful and independent of the grain imports of North Africa. Set apart from the indigenous population by their adherence to the Aryan, that's the positive Christianity promoted by Arius, not Aryan with a Y, denomination, and by laws prohibiting intermarriage, the Goths and later Longobards played the same character-forming role that the first Nordic immigrants in old Republican Rome did. Racial amalgamation. Racial amalgamation only began with the conversion of the Germanic Christians from the Aryan, with an I, not a Y, creed to Roman Catholicism. At last came the Renaissance, a thunderous reassertion of Nordic Germanic blood. With a sudden shattering of constricting social barriers, there arose from the cultivated soil one genius after another. Meanwhile, all of Africanized Italy south of Rome remained mute and uncreative until today, when fascism again, arising from the north, is attempting to reawaken the old values. So there you go with that. The next section is called A Rebirth. talking about Houston Stewart Chamberlain's book. I might turn to this in another series. I just want to skip down to another section real quick. That was the Christian section. Peter Waldo, heretic. This is a very long section that I didn't find very interesting. There's probably very important stuff in it. The Huguenot Revolt, another one. I want to get down to the section called the Myth of the Blood, where he kind of makes the point, and I don't want to read all of it, but it's very long. Racial historiography. These are the section titles. This is all first chapter, by the way. The Myth of the Blood. Okay, so now we're on page 106. If anywhere, it is in the East that the profound truths of racially based historical interpretation are to be found, but also revealed is the great peril in which the Nordic essence now finds itself. Forces eating away at the inside of every land, together with the aroused sewage of the lower depths, obligate everyone concerned about the total culture of Europe to create a solid front of Nordic destiny, one that will cut across the artificial confrontation of victors and vanquished of the Great War. That's World War I, guys. This recognition lays a great duty upon all more deeply inquiring spirits and demands the development of exceptional strength of character. So notice what he's saying. So there's forces eating. The Nordic essence is in a land that's filled with peril. Forces are eating away inside every land. The renewed sewage or aroused sewage of the lower depths, it's obliterating, or it obligates everybody to create a united and solid front of what? Of Nordic destiny. So the vision is, okay, we're going to need a solid front of Nordic destiny to cut across this artificial garbage. And it's going to require a lot of strength of will. At one time, he says, the early Christians found a faith strong enough to enable them to endure all martyrdoms and persecutions. Although earlier, remember, he made a big point about saying that they weren't that bad. When Rome abused this commitment, hundreds of thousands in Europe arose anew, strong in faith, and continued the fight on the pyres of the stake for all for freedom of belief and freedom of inquiry. Others allowed themselves to be hounded from place to place and to be chained in the galleys along with the Negroes and Turks. As Stedingers and Waldenses, they fought to the last man for a life true to their own racial essence. They created all the foundations of Western Nordic culture. Without Coligny and Luther, there would have been no Bach, no Goethe, no Leibniz, and no Kant. Today, a new faith is awakening, the myth of the blood. This is the belief that to defend the blood is also to defend the divine nature of humanity in general. It is a belief radiant with the brightest knowledge that Nordic blood represents that mysterium which has overcome and replaced the old sacraments. A review of history from the remotest past to the present day presents to us the manifold forms of Nordic creative power. Aryan India gave the world a metaphysic which has never since been equaled. Aryan Persia constructed for us the religious myth from which we still draw sustenance. That's the Zoroastrian folk belief, as he put it, or endogamy, folk endogamy. Doric Hellas had a dream of earthly beauty that in static perfection has never again been achieved. Italic Rome taught us that formal state discipline with which a threatened community must fashion and defend itself, and Germanic Europe gave to mankind its most radiant ideal. It taught the necessity of character as the foundation for all culture, and the highest values of the Nordic nature, the concepts of honor and freedom of conscience. This was fought for on battlefields everywhere, as well as in the studies of scholars. If it does not triumph in the coming great struggle, the West and its blood will perish, just as India and Hellas were dissolved forever in chaos. With the recognition of all that is creative in Europe has been a result of character, we have uncovered the essence of European religion, of Germanic science, and of Nordic art. To become fully conscious of this, to experience it with all the passion of a heroic heart, is to create the basis for every rebirth. It is the foundation of a new worldview, of a new yet old idea of the state, of the myth of a new comprehension of life, which alone will give us the strength to throw off the arrogant dominion of the subhumans and to construct a culture in conformity with our own racial character, permeating all facets of existence. It's worth continuing. Sorry. The purpose of Kant's work, A Critique of Pure Reason, is to make us conscious of the formal prerequisites of every possible experience, and to limit the multitudinous opinions of man's activities to specific areas exclusively devoted to them. Ignoring perceptive critical insights has led in all areas to the greatest relapses into barbarism. Kant's critique of knowledge clearly signified a conscious awakening in an era that had begun to weary of religious scholastic the aridity of naturalism, arid as in dry, the aridity of naturalism, and the oppressiveness of the sensual. With due recognition, however, of the great achievement of Kant's critique of reason, it must be added that nothing was determined concerning the inner nature and the manner of employment of rational and spiritual powers. An evaluation of the innermost nature of the various cultures and worldviews was not even attempted. This was adequately supplied by the Roman Catholic system, Jewry, and Islamic fanaticism. In its heart, a people of culture permits no one the right to assess its creations as good or bad, true or false. Cultures are not, in fact, things which descend from the heavens for no known reasons as formal culture cycles upon successive regions of the earth. They are full-blooded creations that are each in their own way, rational and irrational, metaphysically rooted, grouped about an intangible center, and related to a highest value. All possess, even if later distorted, an element of life-enhancing truth. Every race has its soul, and every soul its race, its own unique internal and external architectonic shape, its characteristic form and appearance and demeanor of lifestyle, and a unique relationship between its forces of will and reason. Every race cultivates its own highest ideal. If, by the massive infiltration of alien blood and alien ideas, this is changed or overthrown, the result of this inner metamorphosis is chaos and, over time, catastrophe. A highest value demands a specific connection with other precepts of life that are subject to it. That is, it determines the style of existence of a race, of a people, or of a group of peoples within a nation. Its elimination, therefore, involves the dissolution of the entire inner tension necessary for organic creation. After such catastrophes, it is possible for the spiritual forces to regroup around the old foci and to generate under new conditions a new form of being. This can result either from a final victory over those alien values whose intrusion was merely temporary, or by permitting the crystallization of a second center alongside the first. A juxtaposition in space and time, however, of two or more worldviews, each based upon different highest values, but shared by the same people, is a temporary situation that carries within it the seeds of a new collapse. To the extent that the invading ethos succeeds in weakening the original races and peoples and their ideas, even physically undermining them and subjugating them, it signifies the death of a culture soul and its disappearance even in its external manifestations from the face of the earth. The life of a race, of a people, is not a philosophically logical development, nor even a process that unfolds by natural law. It is the formation of a mystical synthesis of an activity of the soul which cannot be explained by rational deduction, nor made intelligible through analyses of cause and effect. Comprehending the inner heart of a culture consists, therefore, in elucidating its highest religious, moral, philosophic, scientific, and aesthetic values. These determine its total rhythm and simultaneously qualify the reciprocal relationship and arrangements of human powers. A people that is primarily religiously oriented will evolve a different sort of culture than that produced by one in which knowledge or beauty prescribe the form of being. Thus, any philosophy that goes beyond formal rational criticism is less a perception than a confession of faith, a spiritual and racial creed, and an avowal of character values. So this is a doozy of a book. I'm not going to read any more of this to you. This is a real doozy of a book. Like I said, they're very well. I've read a little further than this in the book. As I read through this, I may very well do a second series kind of going through this, and maybe through some of Houston Stewart Chamberlain's book about the 19th century that this is based on. But I'm just there's not a lot to summarize. I bet you're like I was as I've read through this, and you're just kind of like, holy crap, what was that? And so this is the myth of the Nazi experiment. This is the belief that the Nazis were supposed to be moved off of Christianity and into this. Apparently a lot of Nazis on the ground did not actually buy into it, did not actually believe it, but this is what they were supposed to come to. So I'm just going to reread to kind of wrap up here that one paragraph from the end of the Christian section again. At last came the Renaissance as a thunderous reassertion of Nordic Germanic blood. So you have the Catholic Church presiding over Europe in the Middle Ages. It's crap. It's bad. That's because the Catholic Church is not something this guy respects. And at last comes the Renaissance as a thunderous reassertion of Nordic Germanic blood to end the Middle Ages that the Church caused. With a sudden shattering of constricting social barriers, he says, there arose from the cultivated soil one genius after another. Meanwhile, all of Africanized Italy, south of Rome, remained mute and uncreative until today, when fascism, again arising from the north, is attempting to reawaken the old values. Attempting. So fascism is the Nordic ideal, yet again, and just let it all soak in. This is the myth of the 20th century. This is Alfred Rosenberg. This is the chief ideologist of the Nazi Party and the Nazi Reich, the Third Reich. This is the guy that was writing out the mythology that these people were trying to organize social and political life around, the religion that they were to move to off of Christianity through the positive Christianity movement. You can hear the disdain for Christianity, whether Protestant or Catholic, as given here by Rosenberg, and it's all just really bad. There's no denying the intentional, blatant racism of the Nazi regime. It is the center of the Nazi project. And the beliefs were based on a rewriting of history that is properly crazy pants and borderline psychotic and very made up, as you heard. And like I said, I skipped a lot. So we don't need something like this being reinvigorated. To call this pseudo-scientific is just a beginning. It just barely touches anything. It's obviously, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, an attempt to create a pseudo-tradition for the Nazi regimes to then tap into that right-wing or conservative disposition to link past to present to future, the ancestors to the living generation to the unborn, in an unbroken chain. But the thing is the link of the present where this is happening is the broken chain that's being twisted and attached somewhere else. And so this is the mythological past. It paints the picture of the mythological aspired future of rampant progressivism. And of course, because it's racially based, as we've read repeatedly through Hitler, we didn't read it today here with Rosenberg, but as we read repeatedly through Hitler and other Nazis, the objective is going to be to make sure that they got rid of the Nazi experiment was predicated on the idea that getting rid of all the Jews out of Europe and destroying them and the influence that they had on Aryan peoples was central to the project of fixing, purifying the race and the blood, fulfilling the myth of the blood and moving forward. So the fulfillment of the myth of the blood includes the Holocaust and it taken to its full completion. And yes, for Jews, very much for Jews, but not just for Jews, beyond Jews, because racial purity had to be achieved in the Reich. There could be no deformities and so on in mental or physical handicaps. And the other, as you've heard, other races that he's not too fond of, I won't repeat them, they also would have to be purged from the Aryan ideal for the German Nordic vision. And so it ends bad. The Nazi experiment ends bad. It's encoded, as we just heard, it is encoded in the DNA, if you will, of the Nazi vision for the world, the worldview. The experiment itself is predicated on enacting a worldview. This is the myth of the worldview, and it ends in Holocaust. So we don't want to see this reinvigorated, but we are seeing elements of this reinvigorated. So yet again, as we do with every episode, we end it by saying, never again. Never again is always, and therefore never again is also now.